of peace in the world and of honest government. Their lives were tragically cut short, and America took a different path. Yet the possibility they foresaw is still alive, the America that almost was, and yet may be. I've been fighting corporate corruption my entire life, but I understand that today the problem is much larger than a few crooked individuals. The problem is a system that no longer serves the people, and a people who are so divided and so fearful that they are easily ruled. It's time to unlearn the reflexes of fear and blame and find ways to unify ourselves and turn our country around. I won't pretend to you that it will be easy, but I know what it will take. My father said it: love, wisdom, and compassion toward one another, and that's where we need to start. We will scale down the war machine and bring our resources home. We will rebuild our water system, repair our roads, and clean up our environment. We will also clean up government and earn back the people's trust. We will end the secrecy, the censorship, and the surveillance. We will again be a fearless country.
The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it.
We will face honestly the darker parts of our history, the genocide, the racism, not to shame or blame or punish, but to repair as best we can in a spirit of compassion and kindness toward all. I'm inviting all of you to join me to create an America that we can believe in and be proud of again. I'm Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and I'm running for President of the United States.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is going to come out and make a very important announcement. Are you ready for this? My heart is racing. Is yours racing? Can you feel it? Well, I want to personally thank everyone for being here today. It means a lot to me and to Bobby and everyone in our family. And thank you for all our supporters behind us. I am going to introduce a very important person who's going to bring up the man of the hour. So please help me welcome. He is a dear friend, an 8-term former U.S. Congressman, and a twice Democratic candidate for president. Please help me welcome Dennis Kucinich. Dennis!
Hi, I'm Dennis Kucinich, and I'm a Kennedy Democrat. Now, what is a Kennedy Democrat? I found out when my father, Frank J. Kucinich Sr., a lifetime member of Teamsters Local 407 and a father of 7, took me to a labor rally in Cleveland to see the Democratic nominee, U.S. Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts. It was my first political event, unforgettable for Senator Kennedy's ringing testimonial to freedom's holy light and economic security for all Americans. And although it was almost 63 years ago, the standard that Senator Kennedy held up on that day, a standard for peace and prosperity, and held high throughout his presidency, was later picked up by his brother, U.S. Senator from New York, Robert F. Kennedy. And that same standard of an America that is ever evolving and moving along an upward path, the standard of a Kennedy Democrat is ready to once again be raised, this time by Senator Robert F. Kennedy's namesake, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Now, what is a Kennedy Democrat? A Kennedy Democrat fearlessly protects the rights of working men and women. A Kennedy Democrat protects the Constitution of the United States. A Kennedy Democrat defends American civil liberties and the rights of all the people.
Exactly.
A Kennedy Democrat believes in the power of diplomacy when the fate of not only our nation, but the earth itself hangs in the balance. A Kennedy Democrat meets adversity to seek unity. A Kennedy Democrat is unbought and unbossed. And a Kennedy Democrat puts country ahead of self. Now, I'm a Kennedy Democrat, you are Kennedy Democrats, we're all Kennedy Democrats here today. And under the dynamic leadership of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., we will restore the Democratic Party and we will restore the United States of America. We will work with Republicans and all Americans, in the words of Lincoln, to bind up our nation's wounds. Under the healing leadership of a President Robert F. Kennedy Jr., we will become a truly reunited state through faith in America, through good works, and strength through peace. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. understands the trials and tribulations of many Americans. He understands that personal victories occur when one resolves to be a better person, works at it every day, removing self-imposed barriers, and through that spiritual growth becomes even better equipped to guide our nation's transformation. The direction towards a more perfect union begins today with one individual, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who now aligns his path with that of the United States of America. As one of the great environmentalists in our nation, and I would recommend that everybody looks at his record as an environmentalist. When you look at that record as a great environmentalist, you come to understand that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the Paul Revere of our times, moving from town to town, warning us if water is unsafe to drink, warning us if our air is unsafe to breathe, warning us when our food is unsafe to eat, and warning us when pharmaceuticals are unsafe to use, and in each case, showing the nation the way to a happier, quality, and quality of life. That's who Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is. Sr.'s entire life is one of selfless dedication to public health and the health of the planet. At a time when powerful interests can use the media to smear a good man who has devoted his life to the public good, it takes an abundance of courage to continue to stand up and to speak out and defend the public interest, and that's exactly who Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is, and that's the kind of President of the United States he will be. Today, we have a rendezvous with history and destiny. Just as America called forth John F. Kennedy to ask not what your country can do for you, but to ask what you can do for your country. Just as our nation called forth Senator Robert F. Kennedy to look into the future and to dream dreams that never were, and to ask, why not? So too, today, we call forth Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to take up the mantle of national leadership, to rally us, to heal us, to unite us, to show the way towards a peaceful nation and a peaceful world. Today, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. begins his determined stand, as must we all, if we care to make a difference. Mindful of the prescient words of his great father, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, who once addressed students in Cape Town, South Africa, who thought, well, we can never change this situation with apartheid. And Robert F. Kennedy told them something that really is important to all Americans, because it speaks to the ability of each one of us in this audience and watching from across this country and abroad. The ability of each one of us to make a difference. And Senator Kennedy said to these mostly young people words that are ingrained in this country's history. He said, each time a man or a woman stands up for an ideal, acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he or she sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples can create a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the next President of the United States, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
I wanted to do this event in Boston because this is a town that I have strong roots in. I graduated high school here, I went to college here. But more importantly, all of my Kennedy grandparents, Kennedy and Fitzgerald grandparents, landed here in 1848, fleeing British oppression and the potato famine back at home. And they arrived here from a nation where for 800 years there was legalized oppression against Irish Catholics. They had not been able to vote, to exercise their franchise. It was illegal for a Catholic to hold political office, to enter a profession, a doctor or an attorney. It was, one of my ancestors had a priest that was hanged for teaching my ancestors how to read and write, which was illegal to teach a Catholic at that point. And they landed here and they took to politics like a starving man to food. And my grandfather, my great-grandfather, Ronnie Fitz, was the first ghetto Irish mayor of Boston. His daughter, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, was my grandmother. And she loved this country because she understood that this country, for the first time, had given her people the capacity and the opportunity to participate in their own political destiny. And she loved she made her children take the Freedom Walk here in Boston. She took them to Walden Pond on weekends. She took them to Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill and the other major battles of the Revolution. She wanted them to know their history and to love their country. She made all of us, all 29 of her grandchildren, memorize Longfellow's poem. So listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in '75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that fateful day and year. And Paul Revere took off 242 years ago last night from the Old North Church at the North End where she was born, my grandmother was born, and he rode out to conquer, to alert the countryside, and particularly the Minutemen, that a British troop of 800 men was coming to confiscate their arsenal and their powder dump. And those men met the British Army, the largest and most powerful empire in history, on the Old North Bridge 242 years ago today. And they drove them back, and they chased them in retreat through Concord, through Lexington, through Lincoln, through Arlington, into Cambridge, inflicting terrible casualties. And that was the beginning of the American Revolution, but really the revolution had started 2 years before. And it started when British had passed an oppressive law raising the taxes on tea in New England. And this was a law that the British Crown made in collusion with the British East India Company, which the king owned shares in, his ministers owned shares in, and most of the aristocracy owned shares in. And it was their plan to impose the tax on New England merchants, but exempt the British East India Company from the tax, so that they could undersell everybody, and that they would make a profit for their shareholders. So the revolution, and of course, the Americans responded by dressing as Wampanoag Indians and boarding the British East India Company's ships and dumping the tea into the harbor. And that's when the British sent that troop over here to quell the rebellion. So that rebellion was in part against empire, but the spirit of that rebellion was a fury that the colonists had against the corrupt merger of state and corporate power. I've come here today to announce my candidacy for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. be to end the corrupt merger of state and corporate power that is threatening now. Corporate feudalism in our country, to commoditize our children, our Purple Mountain's majesty, to poison our children and our people with chemicals and pharmaceutical drugs, to strip mine our assets, to hollow out the middle class, and keep us in a constant state of war. I can't understand that sign language. I want to start by thanking my wife, Cheryl Hines. I'd be here without Cheryl. And I cannot describe in words what she has brought to my life. She is the wisest person that I know. She's also one of the funniest people I know. And I think the American people get to know her, that they are going to be more excited about having a really funny First Lady in the White House. Who showed up today? My children, Bobby, Kik, Amaryllis, Connor, Kira, Finbar, Aiden. I told them their name tags. And Jack. So that's my grandchildren, Zoe and Cassius and Bobcat. My brother Douglas, my sister Courtney, my nephews Bo and Billy Birdsall and Riley and George and Anthony Shriver. I am so grateful for you coming here. Caro. I said Caro. I'm very, very grateful to all of you for coming. There are other members of my family who are not here today.
Okay.
I'm going to make a confession because I know for most American families, they never have any differences with each other. One guy everywhere. And, but, you know, I want to just say this, I'm very grateful that many of the families who disagree with what I'm doing today, many of the family members have taken the time to write me beautiful letters of love this week, to send me emails, to make telephone calls. I bear no ill will or any kind of disappointment to any of them. They have different views of the politics of this country. My whole family, including myself, have long personal relationships with President Biden. Many of my family members are working in the administration. Many of them also just plain disagree with me on issues like censorship, on war, on public health, and they are entitled to their beliefs, and I respect their opinions on them, and I love them back. And is it too much to hope that we could have the same thing for our country? We have a polarization in this country today that is so toxic and so dangerous that at any time since the Civil War, During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln said, a country or a nation, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And when I talk to both Republican friends and Democratic friends, they talk about this division in almost apocalyptical terms. Nobody can see a safe way or a good way out of it. And people are preparing for a kind of a dystopian future. And part of one of the principal missions of my campaign and of my presidency is going to be to end that division. To do that by encouraging people to talk about the values that we have in common rather than the issues that keep us apart. And also, and this I think is the most important thing, I'm going to do that by telling the truth to the American people. When we fight each other, when blacks fight whites and Republicans fight Democrats and rural fights urban, the people, that merger of corporate power that sits at the top is loving the fighting between us and among us so that they can strip mine our country. And the reason truth is so important, when I was a little boy, nobody in this country would dream that our government would ever lie to the American people. In fact, and that's not a joke, nobody believed it back then. In May of 1960, that changed a little when Gary Powers crashes U-2 in Russia and the Eisenhower administration denied that we had a U-2 program because they didn't know at the time that the Russians had captured Gary Powers. And when the Russians produced them, it was a shock to the American people that their government had lied to them. And then in 1970, during the Vietnam War, of course, we all began to suspect that we were being lied to. And in 71, when the Pentagon Papers came out, we realized, oh, this is what they do. My father, just before he died, told me very sadly, people in authority lie. And the government now lies to us. We all know it. We take it for granted. When my uncle left office when he died in 1963, about 80% of Americans said they trusted their government. Today, 22% trust their government, and 22% trust the press, the lowest level ever. The media is at the lowest either because we know the media lies to us now, and everybody knows it. When there's sources of information that we're always used to and that we need to rely on in democracy, when they start lying to us, Americans look for other sources because they know they're being lied to, and they look for other sources of the truth. And when the media and the corporate captive media and the corporate captive government sees other sources of truth, they have to brand those misinformation, because they threaten their paradigm. They threaten that orthodoxy. And of course, there is a lot of junk on misinformation, but as we know, a lot of the misinformation is just statements that depart from government orthodoxy, so they have to either censor us or they have to lie about what's true and what's not true. And that amplifies the polarization. It amplifies the hatred, the fear, the insecurity, because you know you're being lied to and then you're being silenced. The censorship doesn't work from any point of view, and it's very, very dangerous. My father 55 years ago last month, I sat as a 14-year-old boy behind my father as he announced in the Senate caucus room in Washington, D.C., his campaign for presidency of the United States. And my father at that time was in many ways the same position that I'm in today. He was running against a president of his own party. He was running against a war. He was running at a time of unprecedented polarization in our country. And he had no chance of winning. My father, when he declared, had not a single molecule in him that he believed that he could win the Democratic nomination. Why is that? He had run his brother's campaign in 1960, 8 years before. But now, all the unions were against him with two exceptions, United Auto Workers and Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers. The liberal press was 100% against him, from the New York Times to the Village Voice. The labor union, the big city mayors were against him, including Mayor Daley, who had played a critical role in President Kennedy's nomination. All of the people in the New Frontier, who were his closest friends, were now working for the Johnson White House, so they were against him. The only people that he had with him, even the universities were against him, because they were with McCarthy. The group of Hollywood, like Joanne Woodward, Paul Newman, who had been very close to him, worked very hard for my uncle in '60, were now working for McCarthy. And my father in the universities, my father used to say that McCarthy had all the A students and he had the B and C students. And so the only people he had were people, poor white people in rural areas like Appalachia, poor blacks in the Delta and in our cities, in Watson, Harlem, and East LA, and Indians on the Indian reservations, and that was kind of it. But that hopelessness in his campaign freed him to tell the truth to the American people. So when he went to Indiana University and the medical students said to him, "Who's going to pay for your health care program?" He said, "You are." And when he went to Creighton University, which was a Catholic university in Omaha, and they asked him whether he would support their deferments, he said no. So deferments were the reason most of them were in college, because that was the only way you could get out of Vietnam. And he said no, and they booed him. And he said, "Do you think it's fair that 45% of paratroopers in Vietnam are black? Do you think it's fair that we are sending black children to fight this war because they can't get their kids to college?" But do you think that that is consistent with your Catholic values at this university? And when he ended, they gave him a standing ovation. When he went to Watts and he talked about the importance to the black community of abiding with the law, they applauded him. When he went to the University of Alabama, which he had forcibly integrated by federalizing the National Guard with the United States troops 5 years before, he talked to them about the enduring importance of civil rights. They applauded him. When he went to the University of Kansas and gave a speech to 20,000 people, and the kids in the auditorium, who were all corn-fed, Midwestern, pro-military, pro-Vietnam, and he talked to them for an hour about his evolution and the progression of the Vietnam War. And at the end of that, the applause was so thunderous that Jack Newfield, who was one of those reporters who was with him that time, said it felt like the roof was coming off of the auditorium. The students rushed the stage. They were throwing chairs. They just wanted to hear the truth. That's it. And the day he died, he won the California primary, the most urban state in this country, and the same day the South Dakota primary, the most rural. Exactly. He had succeeded in uniting America and building that bridge just by telling people the truth. I was with my dad when he died in Los Angeles, and we brought him back to New York on Vice President Humphrey's plane on US 2, and we waked him at St. Patrick's Cathedral. And then we brought him from Penn Station in New York to Union Station in Washington, D.C. Normally that's a 2.5-hour train ride, and it took us 7.5 hours because there were 2 million people on the tracks. And that I will never forget, as a 14-year-old boy, what I saw from the windows of that train that day. In all of the urban train stations in Trenton and Newark and Philadelphia and Baltimore, they were crowded with black and white men singing the battle hymn of the Republic. In the countryside, there were white people in military uniforms, there were blacks, there were rabbis and priests. I remember in Delaware there were 7 nuns standing in the back of a yellow pickup truck, just waving handkerchiefs at us as we passed. We saw, I remember passing a Little League game where all of the kids on both sides, both teams, the coaches and all the spectators in the stand were standing with their hands at their hearts in salute. We saw Boy Scout troops saluting military officers and personnel, hippies in tie-dye t-shirts. It was people holding up babies, mothers holding up babies. Many of them had American flags. Many of them had signs that said, "Goodbye, Bobby," or "Pray for us, Bobby." And we got to Union Station in Washington, and President Johnson met us there. And we drove my father's body up past the mall in Washington. And 3 months earlier, my father had communicated with Martin Luther King, and they decided to partner with Marion Wright Edelman, who was one of my father's aides, to organize. They saw that the Vietnam War was destroying the war on poverty. It was sucking all the money, and Johnson essentially had to pull the plug on the war on poverty. And my father told Martin, the poor are never going to get rights in this country until they start politically participating. Let's do a poor people's campaign like we did 2 years before the Civil Rights, or 5 years before the Civil Rights campaign. Bring them all to Washington. So all of these men, thousands of men, were encamped in plastic shanties on the mall. And we drove up past it. Martin had died, a month or a month and a half earlier. Now my father was dead. And we drove up past them. They all came to the sidewalk. And they held their hats against their chests in a salute and bowed their heads as we took my father up the hill across the bridge to Arlington to bury him under a simple stone next to his brother. And 4 years later, I was studying here at college American history, and I came across demographic data that showed that most of those white people that lined that train track and who had supported my father in the primary in 1968, 4 years later in 1972, they voted not for George McGovern, who was very closely in line with my dad, but instead for George Wallace, who was an ardent segregationist, who was antithetical to everything my father believed in. And it occurred to me then, and it struck me many times since, that every nation, like every individual, has a darker side and a lighter side, and that the easiest thing for a politician to do is to appeal to our anger and our bigotry and our hatred and our greed and all the lower angels, the darker angels of our character. and that once in a while we get a political leader who tries to do successfully what my dad did, which is to talk to people in a way that gets them to transcend their narrow self-interest, gets them to transcend their fear and their bigotry and their anger, and see themselves as part of a community, sees themselves as part of a noble experiment, and helps them to find the hero that we all have in each of us. And my father tried to persuade people that we have to avoid the seduction of the notion that we can advance ourselves as a people by leaving our poor brothers and sisters behind, or that the only way we can get security is to get rid of our constitutional rights. And he tried to remind Americans that we each need to be a hero, and he succeeded in doing that. And his trail, unfortunately, was cut short. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my career and what brought me here. I started out, as Dennis mentioned, I spent 35 years as an environmental advocate. At the beginning of my environmental career, end of 1983, the beginning of 1984, a man who was a mentor of mine offered me a job doing high-level environmental policy in Washington or New York, or another job that was kind of doing large purchases of conservation land. And I didn't want to do that kind of environmentalism. I wanted to be in the trenches, working with people, and engaged in hand-to-hand combat against the big polluters. And I wanted to particularly work with people who were most harmed by environmental injury, but also were alienated or marginalized from the mainstream environmental community. My first case as an environmental lawyer was representing the NAACP in a lawsuit against Plaza in New York for trying to put a waste transfer station in the oldest black neighborhood in the Hudson Valley. And I found out during that lawsuit that 4 out of every 5 toxic waste dumps in our country is in a black neighborhood. The largest toxic waste dump in this country is in Mobile, Alabama, which is 85% black. The highest concentration of toxic waste dumps in this country is the south side of Chicago. The most contaminated zip code in California is East LA. And black youth, probably the largest at that time problem with black youth, was that 48% of them had dangerous levels of lead in their blood. And that lead dramatically reduced IQ and also causes severe behavioral problems. And I recognize, I spent a lot of my time over the next 30 years fighting on those kind of issues. I spent summer vacation in jail in maximum security prison in Puerto Rico in 2001 because I had successfully sued the Navy to stop bombing probably the poorest community in our country, the people, the black and brown people who live on the island of Vieques, who are American citizens, but they are not treated that group that I spent the rest of my time with, and the majority of my time, I wanted to work with rural Americans and working class Americans, and particularly hunters and fishermen, the hook and bullet people, who cared deeply as much as any other American about the environment, and yet they felt completely alienated from the mainstream environmental community. So I spent my career working for a blue-collar coalition of commercial and recreational fishermen who mobilized on the Hudson River in 1966 to reclaim the river from its polluters. We have on the Hudson River the oldest commercial fishery in North America. It's 350 years old. Many of the people I represent come from families that have been fishing the river continuously since Dutch colonial times. It's a traditional gear fishery. They They used the same fishing methods that were taught by the Algonquin Indians to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam and then passed down through the generations. One of the enclaves of the commercial fishery on the Hudson is a little village called Crotonville, New York. It's 30 miles north of New York City on the east bank of the river. And the people who lived there in 1966 were not your prototypical, mainstream environmentalists. They were affluent, they were not affluent, they were the opposite of that. They were carpenters, lathers, factory workers, electricians. Half the people in Crotonville made their living, or at least some part of it, fishing or grabbing the Hudson. These were people with little expectation that they'd ever see Yellowstone or Yosemite or the national parks. They didn't have the money to take their families on those kind of vacations. For them, the environment was their backyard. It was the bathing beaches, the swimming holes, the fishing holes, the Hudson. That was their livelihood. It was their recreation. It was their food. And Richie Garrett, who was the first president of the Riverkeeper User Fishermen Association, used to say about the Hudson, it's our Riviera, it's our Monte Carlo. Richie Garrett was a grave digger from Wassering, New York. He used to tell his new followers, I'll be the last to let you down. And in 1966, Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton-Norman rail yard. The oil went up the river on the tides, and it blackened the beaches, and it made the shad taste of diesel, so they couldn't be sold in the Fulton Fish Market in New York City. And all the people in Crotonville came together in the only public building in the town, which was the American Legion Hall. This was a very patriotic community. Crotonville and the neighboring village of Austin had one of the highest enlistment and mortality rates during World War II, and almost all of the original Riverkeeper board and officers and members were former Marines. They were combat veterans from World War II in Korea. Richie Garrett was a former Marine. These weren't radicals, they weren't militants. They were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of our country. But that night they started talking about violence, because they saw something that they thought they owned, which was the abundance of these fisheries and the purity and richness of the Hudson River's waters. And it was being robbed from them by large corporate entities over whom they had no control. And they'd been to the government agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution. The Corps of Engineers, the Conservation Department, the Coast Guard, and they were given the bum's rush. Richie Garrett made more than a dozen separate visits to the Corps of Engineers office in Manhattan, begging the Corps Colonel to do his job and shut down the Penn Central pipe. And the Colonel finally told him in exasperation, these are important people. Speaking of the Penn Central Board of Directors, we can't treat them that way. In other words, we can't force them to comply with the law. So this was classic agency capture. These agencies, these regulatory agencies, had become the sock puppets for the industry they were supposed to be regulating. And by this evening in March of 1966, 300 men and women came together in that American Legion Hall in Crotonville, and all of them had come to the conclusion that government was in cahoots with the polluters. And the only way they were going to reclaim the river for themselves is if they confronted the polluters directly. And somebody suggested they put a match to the oil slick coming out of the Penn Central pipe and burn it up. Somebody else said they should roll a mattress up and jam it up the pipe and flood the rail yard with its own waste. Somebody else said they should float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant, which at that time was killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens and taking food off their family tables. And then a guy stood up named Bob Boyle. He was a first lieutenant combat vet from Korea. He was also by then a world famous fly fisherman and spin fisherman. He was the outdoor editor of Sports Illustrated for 70 years. 2 years earlier, he'd written an article about angling in the Hudson for Sports Illustrated. And in researching it, he had come across an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act. And that statute said it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States. You had to pay a big penalty if you got caught. But also there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned into a polluter got to keep half the fine. And check it out, polluters, the law had never been enforced this group. And he said, we shouldn't be talking about breaking the law, we should be talking about enforcing it. And they resolved that evening. Go out and track down and prosecute every polluter in the Hudson. 18 months later, they shut down the Penn Central Pipe. They got to keep $2,000. There was 2 weeks of wild celebration in the town. They used the money that was left over to go after Bldg, Tuck Tape, Standard Brand, American Cyanamide, the biggest corporation in America, and winning. In 1973, they collected the highest penalty in the United States history against a corporate polluter. They got $200,000 from Anaconda Wire and Cable for dumping toxics at Hastings in New York. They used that money to build a boat. They hired a full-time riverkeeper, a former commercial fisherman, John Cronin. They hired me using bounty money as their attorney. And over the next couple of decades, we brought over 500 successful legal actions against Hudson River polluters. The Hudson River is an international model for ecosystem protection. This is a river that caught fire. It was dead for 20-mile stretches north of New York City, south of Albany. It turned colors depending on what color they were painting the GM trucks at Terrytown, the Terrytown GM plant. Today, it's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre. The Atlantic Ocean, north of the equator, and the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson has inspired the creation of river keepers, water keepers, now 350 of them in 46 countries. We're now the biggest water protection group in the world. The story of the Hudson also has a sad ending because General Electric Company dumps its PCBs into the Hudson to save money and its capacitator plant. And the PCBs, although they've spent $1 billion trying to get them out, there's another $3.5 billion that nobody's ever going to pay. The commercial fish many of the species are too toxic to eat, and commercial fishery has been almost altogether closed. 2,000 families that I represented, now there's probably 2 left. And those are families that enrich the history, the culture, the palate of New York for 3.5 centuries. And they're gone not because their business plan didn't work, because it did work for 3.5 centuries. The thing that didn't work, free market capitalism worked perfectly for them. What didn't work was corporate crony capitalism. Was the General Electric Company had better lobbyists. General Electric didn't have a better business plan, it just had better lobbyists, so it was able to escape the discipline of the free market, corrupt public officials, dump its PCBs in the river, put my fishermen out of work, and everybody in the Hudson Valley now has General Electric's PCBs and their flesh and organs. And that's what corporate crony capitalism does. One of the things that I learned from the fishermen is that there's no daylight between good environmental policy and good economic policy. And you'll hear this mantra, this trope from the big polluters and their indentured servants on Capitol Hill and elsewhere, that we have to choose between economic prosperity and environmental protection. And that's a false choice. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, this is how we ought to be measuring, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the big polluters are urging us to do, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business of liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity. We can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy.